The first drop of red wine hit my cheek before I even realized Ashley had stood up. 1 second I was mid-sentence answering a harmless question from one of my father's business partners about what I'd been working on lately. The next cold liquid splashed across my face, dripped into my collar, and stained the cream silk dress I'd worn specifically so no one could accuse me of trying too hard. The room went dead silent. No music, no laughter, no clinking glasses. Just the soft, humiliating sound of wine dripping onto the marble floor at my parents' New Year's party. "You're making things up," Ashley snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, leeching off the family while pretending to be successful. I stood there, stunned, wine on my skin, dozens of eyes locked on me. My parents froze, mouths slightly open, shock written all over their faces. And in that moment of chaos, when no one knew what to say or who to defend, my Aunt Evelyn slowly stood up from her chair at the head of the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at Ashley and said one sentence that made the entire room feel like it had stopped breathing. That sentence would unravel years of lies, expose a crime no one wanted to believe, and change my family forever. If you've ever been the quiet one in a family that rewards the loudest child, if you've ever watched someone else get everything while you learn to survive on your own, stay with me. This story doesn't end the way you think. And if stories about family drama, betrayal, and quiet revenge resonate with you, make sure you follow along and subscribe, because this is only the beginning. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 30 years old. And I've spent my entire life being the invisible daughter in a family that only ever saw one star. That star was my younger sister, Ashley. In our house, Ashley was what my mother liked to call special, not in the way that meant fragile or misunderstood. Special in the way that meant rules bent, consequences disappeared, and praise flowed freely, no matter what she did. Ashley didn't just walk through doors. Doors opened for her before she even reached them. When she got into a prestigious private high school, my parents threw a dinner party. When she was accepted to Harvard, they flew in relatives from 3 states away. When she turned 17, a brand new BMW appeared in our driveway with a red bow on the hood, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I remember standing at the kitchen window that morning, watching her run outside in her pajamas, squealing as my father handed her the keys. No one noticed I was there. No one asked how I planned to get to my part-time job that afternoon, using a bus schedule folded so many times it was falling apart. That was the pattern. Ashley received. I adjusted. By the time we were adults, the roles were so deeply set that no one questioned them anymore. Ashley went straight from college into a high-ranking position at our family's company. No interviews, no competition. Just a title and an office with a view. My parents called it training her for leadership. I called it what it was, entitlement dressed up as opportunity. I took a different path. Not because I was brave or noble, but because I learned early that waiting for fairness in my family was like waiting for rain in a drought. It didn't come. So I stopped looking up and started looking ahead. I paid my way through school. I worked jobs that didn't impress anyone at dinner parties. I learned how money actually worked instead of how it looked. I stayed quiet. Not because I was ashamed, but because silence was safer. In my family, information was currency, and I had no interest in handing mine over. By the time Ashley was showing off her job title and posting photos from expensive restaurants she didn't pay for, I was building something small, steady, and mine. I didn't talk about it. I didn't announce it. I didn't need applause. Which is why, standing there at my parents' New Year's party with wine dripping down my neck, I realized Ashley's outburst had nothing to do with that one sentence I'd said. It had everything to do with the fact that I existed outside her story. The party itself was supposed to be perfect. My mother had spent weeks planning it. Business partners, extended family, close friends, all gathered under crystal chandeliers and carefully curated playlists. Ashley had been in her element all night, laughing loudly, holding court, soaking up attention like sunlight. I'd stayed near the edges, talking to people who asked real questions. And when someone casually asked me how my year had been, I answered honestly without thinking it would matter. "I've been busy," I said. "I finalized another investment recently." That was it. One sentence. Calm, factual. Not a boast, not a challenge. But to Ashley, it was an act of rebellion. After the wine glass hit me and Evelyn stood up, I felt something shift deep in my chest. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. I had seen this look in Ashley before, usually right before my parents rushed in to fix things for her. Only this time, no one rushed in. And for the first time in my life, I understood something with absolute clarity. The truth doesn't need to shout. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't ask permission. What happened next would expose more than jealousy. It would uncover theft, betrayal, and a carefully constructed lie that nearly destroyed my life. And it all started because the golden daughter couldn't stand the idea that I had built something without her knowing. If you've ever wondered what happens when favoritism collides with reality, stay with me. This story is about what they give you, what they take from you, and what happens when you quietly take yourself back. I learned very early that in my family, love came with a hierarchy. It wasn't written down anywhere, but everyone understood it instinctively. Ashley stood at the top, glowing and unquestioned. The rest of us orbited around her, adjusting our paths so we wouldn't interfere with her shine. I didn't resent it at first. As a kid, you assume whatever you're given is normal. You don't question why one child's mistakes are funny while another's are character flaws. You just adapt. The first time I remember noticing it clearly, I was 16. Ashley was 14 and had just bombed a math exam. My mother laughed when the teacher called, saying Ashley just wasn't a numbers person and promising to handle it. That same week, I brought home a report card with straight A's, except for one B+ in chemistry. My father studied it quietly, then asked me what went wrong. Not in anger, in disappointment, like I'd failed an unspoken contract. That was when I understood the rules were different. Ashley's shortcomings were quirks. Mine were warnings. By the time we were both applying to colleges, the imbalance had become part of the furniture. Ashley talked about her future constantly, her words bouncing off walls already prepared to receive them. My parents hired a private admissions consultant, toured campuses with her, and rearranged schedules around interviews. Dinner conversations revolved around her essays, her interviews, her potential. I applied quietly late at night after work. I paid my own application fees and didn't ask for feedback. When acceptance letters arrived, Ashley's came first. A thick envelope. Ivy League crest. My mother cried. My father opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving for something special. My acceptance arrived 3 days later. It sat unopened on the kitchen counter, tucked under grocery coupons and unopened mail, until I finally slid it into my backpack and read it alone in my room. A solid school. A practical program. Exactly what I needed. No one noticed when I enrolled. That pattern repeated itself over and over. Ashley received announcements. I made adjustments. When she turned 17, the BMW appeared in the driveway like a crown jewel. My parents filmed her reaction on their phones, capturing every gasp and squeal. That afternoon, my father asked me if I could start contributing more to my phone bill now that I was working. I didn't argue. I never did. Arguing implied expectation, and expectation led to disappointment. So instead, I learned how to be self-contained. I learned how to say it's fine and mean I've already figured it out. I learned how to succeed quietly, because noise in my family attracted the wrong kind of attention. Ashley, on the other hand, learned something very different. She learned that admiration was automatic, that doors opened when she knocked, that if something went wrong, someone else would absorb the impact. When teachers complained, my parents intervened. When she missed deadlines, exceptions were made. When she wanted something, the conversation wasn't whether she should have it, but how soon. By the time she left for college, Ashley didn't just expect special treatment. She believed it was her due. She came home during breaks with stories about professors who didn't recognize her brilliance, classmates who were intimidated systems that were rigged. My parents listened sympathetically, nodding along, reinforcing the idea that obstacles weren't lessons. They were insults. I watched all of this from a careful distance, not because I was indifferent, but because proximity was dangerous. Any comparison, any overlap, any shared space risked turning me into the problem. I'd seen it happen too many times. Ashley didn't tolerate competition, even imaginary competition. And my parents, desperate to preserve harmony, would always choose the path of least resistance. That path never ran through me. So I stepped aside. I limited visits. I redirected conversations. When asked about my plans, I answered vaguely. Work is busy. Things are fine. I learned how to be present without being visible, a skill that came in handy later. Ashley, meanwhile, returned from college, transformed. Louder, sharper, more convinced of her own importance. When she graduated, my parents didn't ask her what she wanted to do next. They told her. She would join the family company. They framed it as a learning opportunity, a stepping stone, a chance to gain real-world experience. The title they gave her sounded impressive enough to impress strangers and vague enough to deflect scrutiny. Ashley accepted it like a birthright, already discussing changes she planned to make before she'd spent a single day there. I remember sitting at that dinner table watching my parents beam with pride and feeling something settle into place inside me. Not anger. Acceptance. This was who they were. This was who she was becoming. And this was the moment I fully understood that my survival depended on separation, not confrontation. I didn't challenge the decision. I didn't point out that Ashley had no experience, no patience, and no understanding of accountability. I didn't mention the longtime employees who'd worked their way up slowly, carefully, waiting for recognition that would never come. I smiled. I congratulated her. I excused myself early. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I felt lighter than I had in years. Because clarity, even painful clarity, is a form of freedom. That was the night I stopped wishing my family would see me differently. Instead, I focused on seeing myself clearly. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because my value didn't fit their narrative. And once I understood that, I stopped trying to rewrite it. I started building something separate, something quiet, something that didn't require permission. Ashley never noticed. She was too busy stepping into a world designed to cushion her fall. Too busy believing that the spotlight would always be there waiting. She didn't realize that while she was being handed a stage, I was learning how to build foundations. And foundations, unlike spotlights, don't flicker when the power shifts. By the time Ashley stepped into the company, as if it had been waiting for her all along, I had already learned how to build a life that didn't depend on applause. I didn't announce that decision. I didn't frame it as independence or rebellion. I simply stopped orbiting. I stopped showing up to conversations that were designed to compare, measure, and diminish. Distance wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. And for the first time, it belonged to me. I kept my visits short. I deflected questions with practiced ease. When my mother asked about work, I gave her enough to satisfy curiosity without offering anything to dissect. When relatives asked what I was doing these days, I smiled and said I was staying busy. Busy was a word that ended conversations quickly. It didn't invite commentary. Ashley, meanwhile, was everywhere. She talked about her new role constantly, as if repetition could make authority real. She complained about inefficiencies she hadn't taken time to understand. She criticized processes she hadn't helped build. My parents nodded along, mistaking confidence for competence. I watched it happen from a safe distance, and instead of feeling angry, I felt resolved. Because while Ashley was being handed a title, I was earning fluency. My education had never been glamorous. It was practical, deliberate, and entirely my responsibility. I worked during the day and studied at night, learning concepts that didn't make for interesting dinner conversation but mattered in the real world. Cash flow, risk exposure, long-term planning. I wasn't interested in sounding impressive. I wanted to be effective. There were no celebrations when I finished, no champagne, no speeches. I marked milestones alone quietly, with a sense of progress that didn't need witnesses. I paid off loans in small, satisfying increments. I tracked expenses. I learned patience. After graduation, I took a job that most people would have overlooked. It wasn't prestigious. It didn't come with a corner office or a title that impressed strangers. But it gave me something far more valuable: access. I watched how decisions were made. I observed where money leaked and where it accumulated. I noticed how confident people spoke when they didn't understand something, and how careful people became when they did. I listened more than I talked. I took notes. I asked questions when it mattered and stayed quiet when it didn't. That's where I learned the first rule Ashley never understood. Wealth doesn't announce itself. It organizes itself. My first investment wasn't bold or impressive. It didn't make headlines or spark envy. It was small, calculated, and terrifying. I ran the numbers so many times I could recite them in my sleep. I prepared for everything that could go wrong because no one was coming to rescue me if it did. When I signed the paperwork, my hands shook. Not because I was unsure, but because it mattered. That investment didn't change my lifestyle. It didn't upgrade my car or my wardrobe. It changed my confidence. Slowly. Quietly. Like compound interest working its magic behind the scenes. I reinvested instead of celebrating. I chose stability over validation. I learned to live well below what I could afford, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Every decision I made strengthened my position. Every month, the gap between what I earned and what I spent widened, and with it, my sense of control. My family didn't notice. They didn't ask, and I didn't tell. Not because I was hiding, but because experience had taught me that success in my family came with strings. Praise became leverage. Curiosity turned into entitlement. I had no desire to negotiate my future at someone else's dinner table. Ashley, on the other hand, measured worth in visibility. She posted photos from expensive restaurants. She talked loudly about meetings she barely attended. She complained about how hard leadership was while benefiting from protections no one else had. She needed witnesses to feel real. I needed results. We existed in the same family but in entirely different worlds. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of discomfort. A question asked too sharply. A joke that landed with an edge. Ashley noticed that I wasn't impressed, that I didn't seek her approval, that I wasn't playing my assigned role anymore. And nothing unsettles someone like realizing they no longer have an audience. Still, she didn't feel threatened. Not yet. Because in her mind, success only counted if it looked like hers. And mine didn't. I kept my circle small, my life simple, my goals private. I didn't need anyone's permission to move forward. I didn't need validation to keep going. Every choice I made was rooted in one guiding principle: build something no one could take from me. That mindset changed everything. When challenges came, I didn't panic. I adjusted. When opportunities appeared, I evaluated them carefully. I didn't chase growth. I planned for it. Over time, what I built gained momentum, the kind that doesn't rely on luck or optics. And still my family remained unaware. Not because I was deceiving them, but because they had trained themselves not to look in my direction. I existed outside their narrative, and that invisibility became my greatest advantage. Ashley was the golden daughter, polished and protected, standing under a spotlight she believed would never dim. I was the one working in the background, strengthening the structure she never noticed. We were moving on parallel paths, but only one of us understood the cost of imbalance. I didn't build my life to compete with her. I built it to escape the gravitational pull of a system that thrived on favoritism. And by the time Ashley realized I had built anything at all, it was already too late for her to control it. Because the most dangerous thing to someone who has always been indulged isn't failure. It's discovering that someone they underestimated no longer needs them. Once Ashley had been given money without limits, giving her power felt inevitable to my parents. They announced it over dinner as if they were sharing good news, not altering the balance of an entire company. My mother smiled proudly. My father cleared his throat and spoke about fresh perspectives and preparing the next generation. Ashley sat back in her chair, already nodding, already owning the moment. The title they gave her sounded impressive, polished enough to impress outsiders and vague enough to avoid questions. I watched the scene unfold with the strange detachment that comes when you've already accepted the ending. This wasn't a debate. It was a coronation. They framed it as temporary, educational, a chance for Ashley to learn the business from the inside. But the authority was real, and everyone in the room understood it. You could hear it in the way longtime employees forced polite smiles. You could see it in the way no one asked what qualifications she had or what experience she was bringing with her. Ashley didn't notice any of that. She was already talking about changes she wanted to make, systems she wanted to modernize, decisions she planned to streamline. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a meaningful way. I didn't challenge it. I never did. Years earlier, I might have pointed out the obvious, that Ashley had never worked a full week without special accommodations, that she had no patience for details and no tolerance for being questioned. That leadership wasn't something you absorbed by proximity. But I had learned the cost of saying things my parents didn't want to hear. So I stayed quiet. Ashley's first months at the company were met with indulgence. Mistakes were brushed off as learning curves. Missed deadlines became adjustment periods. Every concern raised by staff was softened before it reached. My parents filtered through the assumption that Ashley meant well and just needed time. Time, it turned out, was exactly what she was given. She arrived late, left early, delegated aggressively without understanding the work she was delegating. She signed off on expenses she didn't fully read, trusting that the numbers would somehow align because they always had before. When questioned, she smiled and reminded people who her parents were. And people listened. I stopped by the office only occasionally, usually to drop off paperwork or meet with my Aunt Evelyn. Evelyn had been with the company longer than anyone except my father. She was the chief accountant, a role that rarely earned applause but quietly kept everything from collapsing. She spoke softly, dressed plainly, and noticed everything. Ashley treated her with polite impatience. I saw it in small moments. Ashley interrupting Evelyn mid-sentence. Ashley brushing off questions about documentation. Ashley signing approvals before Evelyn finished explaining the implications. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise alarms on its own. Just a pattern forming piece by piece. Employees adjusted quickly. Questions stopped being asked. Processes loosened. Documentation grew thinner. People learned which approvals mattered and which ones didn't. Ashley liked decisiveness, not scrutiny, so scrutiny disappeared. Once, while waiting near Evelyn's office, I overheard a project manager hesitate before answering a basic question. He glanced down the hall, then lowered his voice. Another employee avoided eye contact entirely, as if looking at me might somehow implicate him in something he didn't want to understand. That was the first time unease settled in my stomach. I mentioned it to my parents gently, carefully, not as an accusation, as an observation. My father waved it off, saying every transition came with friction. My mother reminded me that Ashley was under a lot of pressure and needed support, not criticism. "You always overthink things," she said, smiling as if it were a harmless trait. I didn't push. I never did. Ashley made a mistake not long after that. A small one on paper, an expensive one in reality. It cost the company money and embarrassed a department that had worked hard to keep things running smoothly. The employees involved expected consequences. Instead, my parents absorbed it. They reframed it. They smoothed it over with apologies that never reached the people who did the work. Ashley learned the lesson she had been learning her whole life. Mistakes don't matter if someone else cleans them up. That was when I realized something had shifted permanently. Ashley wasn't just protected anymore. She was insulated. And insulation breeds carelessness. Evelyn noticed too. She didn't say anything outright. She never challenged Ashley in front of others. But I started seeing her double-checking reports that had already been approved, staying late, asking questions that went unanswered. Once our eyes met across a conference room, and in that brief exchange I saw concern she hadn't put into words yet. She was watching. My parents, meanwhile, doubled down on their faith in Ashley. They praised her confidence, defended her decisions, interpreted criticism as jealousy or resistance to change. To them, Ashley wasn't reckless. She was visionary. Anyone who didn't see that simply didn't understand her. I understood her perfectly. Ashley wasn't malicious at first. She wasn't plotting or scheming in the beginning. She was entitled. She believed the rules existed for other people. She believed that because she had always been forgiven, she always would be. And when someone believes that deeply enough, boundaries start to feel optional. I stepped back further. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. This wasn't my fight. Not yet. I wasn't inside the company. I wasn't part of the decision-making chain. I was an observer with no authority and no desire to be collateral damage. Still, I watched. I watched Ashley grow more comfortable overriding processes. I watched employees stop documenting conversations. I watched the small safeguards that kept the company stable loosen under the weight of unchecked confidence. And I watched Evelyn quietly begin to keep her own records. Nothing had exploded yet. No accusations had been made. No truths spoken aloud. But the foundation was shifting, and I could feel it in the way people moved, the way conversations stopped when Ashley entered the room, the way trust thinned without anyone naming it. That was the moment I understood something my parents couldn't see. The company hadn't corrupted Ashley. It had simply given her access to act on what had always been there. When someone is taught that rules bend for them, eventually they stop seeing rules at all. And when authority meets entitlement without accountability, collapse isn't a possibility. It's a timeline. I didn't know then how far it would go or how much damage it would do. I only knew that whatever was coming wouldn't be loud at first. It would happen quietly in spreadsheets and signatures and decisions no one questioned, because questioning had become inconvenient. Ashley thought the company door had opened for her. She didn't realize it had also opened a path she couldn't control once she stepped onto it. While Ashley was settling into her office and learning how to enjoy authority, I was learning how to disappear on purpose. Not vanish exactly. Just step out of the line of sight where comparisons were made and expectations were imposed. I stopped measuring my life against my family's reactions. I stopped hoping for approval that had never come without conditions. Distance became my discipline. I limited my visits home to holidays and birthdays. When I did show up, I kept conversations light and short. I asked about other people's lives. I listened. I didn't offer updates unless directly asked, and even then I kept them vague. It wasn't secrecy, it was self-preservation. Ashley thrived on being seen. I thrived on not needing to be. My education reflected that difference. I chose programs that made sense, not ones that sounded impressive when spoken out loud. I paid my way through school one semester at a time, balancing classes with work that left me exhausted, but clear-headed. I wasn't chasing prestige. I was building competence. There were no celebration dinners when I passed exams. No proud announcements. I studied, tested, passed, and moved on. Each completed course felt like laying another brick in a structure only I could see. I learned early that knowledge was safest when it was useful, not performative. After graduation, I took a job that most people overlooked. The title didn't sparkle. The office was small. But the exposure was real. I watched how money moved through systems. I learned where inefficiencies hid. I paid attention to the people who spoke least and controlled most. I kept spreadsheets. I tracked patterns. I asked myself quiet questions and answered them honestly. What holds value over time? What collapses under pressure? Who benefits when no one is paying attention? Ashley wouldn't have lasted a week doing that work. She needed validation. I needed understanding. That understanding led me somewhere unexpected. Real estate wasn't glamorous the way my family defined success, but it made sense to me. Tangible assets, predictable risks, clear consequences. You couldn't charm a property into performing. You had to manage it. My first investment was small and terrifying. I ran the numbers until they blurred. I double-checked every assumption. There was no backup plan. No one to call if I made a mistake. The responsibility sat squarely on my shoulders, and instead of breaking me, it focused me. When I signed the paperwork, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. That property didn't change my lifestyle. It changed my mindset. It taught me patience. It taught me restraint. It taught me that real growth doesn't announce itself. It compounds quietly, reward stacking on reward, as long as you don't sabotage it with ego. I reinvested everything. I kept my expenses low. I chose boring over flashy and reliable over impressive. Each decision was intentional. Each step forward made the next one easier. And still no one in my family noticed. They didn't ask, and I didn't volunteer. Experience had taught me that in my family, success was never just acknowledged. It was evaluated, compared, and eventually claimed. I wasn't interested in having my progress reframed as family property. Ashley talked constantly about work stress and leadership challenges. She complained about employees who didn't get her vision. She laughed about signing off on things she didn't fully understand, confident it would all work out. My parents listened with concern and pride, mistaking noise for effort. I listened too quietly, noting what she said and what she didn't. The more Ashley talked, the more I understood how fragile her position actually was. Her authority was borrowed. Her confidence depended on applause. Her identity was tied to how others saw her. Without attention, she unraveled. I didn't need attention to function. I needed structure. That difference became my shield. People sometimes ask why I never shared my success sooner. Why I didn't correct assumptions or defend myself when Ashley made comments about me playing it safe or never aiming high. The answer is simple. In my family, success is currency, and currency attracts control. If I had spoken up earlier, curiosity would have turned into scrutiny. Praise would have turned into entitlement. My choices would have become topics of debate, leverage for guilt, justification for interference. I had watched it happen too many times to mistake it for support. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because silence kept my life intact. Over time, my investments grew, slowly at first, then with momentum. Each success reinforced the last. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't upgrade my lifestyle. I didn't post photos or drop hints. I lived comfortably and below my means, letting the gap between income and expense widen until it felt like breathing room. Ashley never noticed. She was too busy performing success to recognize substance. She believed power came from position, not preparation. She assumed that because she was visible, she was untouchable. I saw something else forming. While Ashley was learning how to be admired, I was learning how to be independent. While she relied on exceptions, I relied on systems. While she leaned on my parents' protection, I leaned on numbers that didn't care who I was. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ashley had everything she'd been given, and I had everything I'd built. The difference wasn't just effort. It was durability. I didn't build my life to prove anything to my family. I built it so I would never need their permission again. By the time Ashley would finally notice what I'd been doing, it wouldn't be because I announced it. It would be because my existence outside her orbit disrupted a balance she thought was permanent, and that I would later understand was what she could never forgive. She didn't lose control because I bragged. She lost control because I had learned how to succeed without her knowing. Because nothing unsettles someone more than realizing the person they underestimated has been quietly building leverage the entire time. And once leverage exists, the illusion of superiority becomes very fragile. The New Year's party was already loud when I arrived, the kind of polished noise that comes from too much champagne and carefully rehearsed laughter. My mother had outdone herself. Crystal glasses, catered trays, a string quartet playing softly in the corner. Business partners mingled with relatives, and everyone looked exactly as successful as they wanted to be seen. Ashley was in her element, moving through the room like she owned it, greeting people with practiced warmth, laughing a little too loudly, touching arms when she spoke. I stayed near the edge of the room, holding a glass of water, letting conversations pass around me. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't need to be center stage. I'd learned that visibility in my family came at a price, and I was no longer willing to pay it. A distant cousin asked how my year had been. I gave the standard answer: busy, productive, nothing dramatic. Then one of my father's longtime business partners joined us, someone I'd known since childhood. He smiled kindly and asked what I'd been focusing on lately. I answered without thinking. "I've been working on expanding my investments," I said. "I finalized another property recently." It was a simple sentence. Calm, factual, no numbers, no qualifiers. I wasn't announcing anything. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was just the truth spoken without armor. I didn't notice Ashley at first. What I noticed was the shift in the room. Conversations softened, then stalled. A laugh died halfway through. I felt it before I saw it, that subtle tightening in the air, the instinctive awareness that something had changed. When I turned, Ashley was staring at me from across the room. Her smile was gone. Her jaw was tight, her fingers wrapped around a glass of red wine so firmly her knuckles had gone white. For a moment, she didn't move. She just watched me, eyes sharp, calculating. And then she started walking toward us. People stepped aside, instinctively sensing something they didn't yet understand. Ashley stopped directly in front of me, her body angled just enough to make sure everyone nearby could hear. "Another property." She repeated, her voice light but edged with disbelief. "Really?" I nodded once. "Yes." Her laugh was short and sharp. "That's funny," she said. "Because last time I checked you were still playing it safe, doing—" What was it again? I felt the familiar pull, the old reflex to minimize, to deflect, to disappear. I ignored it. "I work in finance," I said evenly. "I invest." Her expression hardened. "You're making things up," Ashley snapped, her voice rising. "Leeching off the family while pretending to be successful. That's what you've always done." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because they were designed to humiliate. Heads turned. The small circle around us grew. My parents froze a few feet away, shock etched across their faces. I opened my mouth to respond, not in anger but in disbelief. I never got the chance. Ashley lifted her arm and threw the glass. The wine hit my cheek, first cold and sticky, then splashed down my neck and chest. The glass itself shattered against the floor near my feet, the sound sharp and final. Red liquid dripped from my hairline, stained my dress, pooled on the marble tiles. The room went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The string quartet stopped playing. Even the air felt frozen, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I stood there, wine dripping from my skin, staring at my sister. Not shocked, not angry, just clear. This wasn't about jealousy. This wasn't about money. This was about control. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father looked like he'd been struck. Someone whispered my name. Someone else reached for napkins but stopped uncertain. Ashley stood rigid, chest rising and falling, eyes blazing. She looked around as if daring someone to challenge her. That was when Aunt Evelyn stood up. She rose slowly from her chair at the head of the table, smoothing her jacket as she did. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at my parents. She looked straight at Ashley. The room seemed to contract around her presence. Ashley Evelyn said calmly, her voice steady and precise, "You might want to sit down." Ashley scoffed. "Stay out of this," she snapped. "This is family." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. "This stopped being just family a long time ago," she said. Every eye in the room shifted. My parents turned toward her, confusion mixing with unease. Ashley's confidence wavered for the first time. "I've been reviewing the company accounts." Evelyn continued, her tone professional, almost detached. "And there are some discrepancies we need to address." Ashley laughed again, but it sounded forced. "Discrepancies," she said. "Are you serious right now?" Evelyn nodded once. "Yes, I am." The silence deepened. The humiliation of the wine faded into something heavier, something sharper. I felt it settle into my chest, not fear, but understanding. This wasn't a defense. It was a warning. Ashley's eyes flicked briefly to my parents, then back to Evelyn. "You're accusing me of something because she can't handle the truth," she said, gesturing toward me without looking. "I'm stating facts," Evelyn replied. "And tonight is not the time to go into details. But it is the time to stop pretending nothing is wrong." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. My mother's face had gone pale. I stood there wine-stained and silent, watching the balance of the room tilt. For the first time in my life, Ashley wasn't controlling the narrative. She wasn't the loudest voice. She wasn't the center of gravity. She was exposed, not yet proven guilty, not yet confronted with evidence, but stripped of certainty. I realized then that I hadn't come to this party to confront anyone. I hadn't planned to reveal anything or provoke a scene. All I had done was exist honestly in a space where honesty had always been inconvenient. And that was enough. Ashley didn't lose control because I bragged. She lost control because my life no longer fit inside the story she told about herself. As people slowly began to move again, whispers replacing silence, I wiped my face with a napkin someone finally handed me. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. The truth hadn't exploded into the room. It had simply stood up. And once it did, nothing in my family would ever return to the way it had been. The silence after Evelyn spoke was heavier than the wine on my dress. No one rushed to fill it. No one laughed it off. The room, moments ago a stage for celebration, felt suddenly exposed like a set, with the lights turned too bright. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant clink of someone setting down a glass with careful hands. Ashley stood frozen, her expression caught between disbelief and calculation. Evelyn remained standing, hands resting lightly on the back of her chair. In that moment, she wasn't my aunt. She was the company's chief accountant, the woman who signed off on numbers everyone else preferred not to question, the one who had survived audits, recessions, and family tempers by being precise and patient. Ashley recovered first. She always did. "This is ridiculous," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "You're really doing this here, over some bookkeeping nonsense." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She let the words settle, let the room register Ashley's instinctive denial. Then she spoke calmly. "This didn't start tonight," she said, "and it isn't nonsense." My parents exchanged a glance. My mother's hands twisted together in front of her knuckles, pale. My father took a step toward Evelyn, then stopped as if unsure whether he was walking into an argument or a confession. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, his voice tight. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "I'm saying there have been irregularities in the accounts for some time now. Repeated ones. And they all trace back to the same approvals." Ashley's smile vanished. "You're accusing me of stealing," she snapped. "Because that's what this sounds like." "I'm stating facts," Evelyn replied. "And facts don't accuse. They reveal." A ripple moved through the room. Relatives shifted their weight. A business partner quietly excused himself toward the hallway, pretending to take a phone call. People were choosing distance without quite knowing why. Ashley shook her head, her voice rising. "This is unbelievable. You're all just standing there letting her say this?" She looked at my parents, waiting for them to intervene to shut it down the way they always had. For a moment, I thought they would. Old habits die hard. But my father didn't speak. He stared at Evelyn, something fragile cracking behind his eyes. My mother swallowed hard, her gaze darting between Evelyn and Ashley like she was watching a collision she couldn't stop. "How much?" my father asked quietly. The question landed like a stone dropped into water. Evelyn exhaled once, slow and steady. "Over $120,000, she said. "Over time." Ashley's face drained of color. "That's insane," she said. "You can't just throw out a number like that without proof." "I wouldn't," Evelyn replied. "And I didn't. She didn't pull out documents. She didn't spread papers across the table. She didn't need to." The weight of certainty in her voice did more damage than any stack of evidence could have. "This is a misunderstanding." Ashley insisted, her words coming faster now. "You know how complicated things get? Expenses, reimbursements, approvals. Anyone could misread that." Evelyn nodded. "That's true," she said, "which is why I don't rely on single entries. I look at patterns." I watched Ashley closely. She never said she hadn't taken the money. She never said the transactions weren't hers. She argued process, not innocence. The room noticed. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Ashley," she whispered, "please tell me this isn't true." Ashley turned to her, desperation flashing across her face. "Mom, of course it's not. They're turning this into something it's not." "You know me." Evelyn's voice cut in gently but firmly. "Sharon, this isn't about who Ashley is as a person. It's about what the records show." That distinction mattered. I saw it land. For the first time, my parents were being asked to separate love from accountability, and it terrified them. My father ran a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked Evelyn. "I've been tracking it quietly," she said. "Verifying. Making sure. Because once you say something like this out loud, you don't get to take it back." Ashley scoffed. "So you just decided to ambush me at a party?" "No," Evelyn said. "You did that when you threw a glass at your sister." All eyes shifted to me. I hadn't spoken since the wine hit my face. I didn't need to. For the first time, my silence wasn't read as weakness. It was read as restraint. "This isn't the time or place to go through everything," Evelyn continued. "But it is the time to stop pretending nothing is wrong. We will address this properly. Professionally." Ashley's breathing quickened. "You're trying to ruin me," she said, her voice trembling now. Over a few accounting lines. "This isn't about ruining anyone," Evelyn replied. "It's about protecting the company." That was the sentence that broke something open. The company, not the family, not Ashley's image. The entity my parents had built their lives around, the one Ashley treated like an extension of herself. My father sank into a chair. My mother followed, clutching his arm as if the ground had shifted beneath them. Around us, conversations restarted in hushed fragments. People edged closer to the exits, drawn by instinct and discomfort. Ashley looked around, realizing too late that the room had changed sides, not in loyalty, but in attention. The narrative she controlled had fractured, and she no longer knew how to pull it back together. "This isn't over," she said sharply, her voice regaining some edge. "You don't get to decide this." Evelyn met her gaze. "You're right," she said. "I don't. The facts do." I felt something loosen in my chest, then a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Clarity. Ashley hadn't lost control because I spoke. She lost control because someone with authority finally did. As the party dissolved around us, guests offering awkward apologies and quiet exits, I stood there wine-stained and steady, watching my sister grapple with a reality she had never prepared for. Once the truth enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. It sits there, undeniable, waiting for everyone else to catch up. And nothing I knew then would ever be the same again. By Monday morning, the party already felt like a rumor that had escaped our control. My phone buzzed non-stop before I even finished my first cup of coffee. Missed calls from my mother, a clipped voicemail from my father asking me to come by later so we can talk. Messages from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly concerned about my well-being. None of them asked how my face was after the wine glass. None of them asked what I was feeling. They wanted reassurance, stability, a version of the story that didn't threaten their sense of normal. At work, I tried to focus, but numbers blurred together on my screen. I'd built my career on clarity and precision, yet now everything felt strangely fragile, as if facts alone might not be enough to protect me. That illusion shattered just after noon. I was pulled into a small conference room by HR, the door closing with a softness that made my stomach drop. Two people I barely knew sat across from me, their expressions careful, rehearsed. "There's been a concern raised," one of them began. "It involves a potential conflict of interest related to your family's company." I felt the blood drain from my face. What kind of concern? They slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents that made my breath catch. Invoices, expense reports, wire transfers. My name highlighted in yellow, payments to a consulting entity I'd never heard of. Approvals bearing signatures that looked uncomfortably close to mine. "This isn't real," I said, the words coming out hoarse. "I've never seen these." "We're not making any conclusions yet," the other person said. "But given the situation with your family, we needed to notify you." Ashley hadn't just been defending herself. She'd been building a counterattack. By the time I left that room, my hands were shaking. Not with fear exactly, but with something colder. Recognition. Ashley had always won arguments by reframing them, by shifting blame until everyone else doubted themselves. This was that instinct sharpened and weaponized. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to take me down with her. I drove straight to Evelyn's office. She was already expecting me. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked as soon as I walked in. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "She's accusing me." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I suspected she might." "You suspected," I echoed. "She's been preparing for this longer than anyone realizes," Evelyn said. The moment I started limiting her access, she started building alternative narratives. She pulled open a drawer and handed me a thick folder. "This is why I asked you to come." Inside were timelines, transaction histories, notes written in Evelyn's neat, deliberate handwriting. "She created shell documentation," Evelyn continued. "Not well enough to stand up to forensic review, but convincing enough to cause doubt, especially if people want to believe it. My parents, the company board, law enforcement if it went that far. I need you to understand something," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "This is no longer just a family matter. Ashley crossed into criminal territory the moment she forged records with your name on them." The word criminal landed heavily. "I didn't do anything wrong," I said, more to myself than to her. "I know," Evelyn replied, "and we're going to prove it. But you need to be prepared. This will get ugly before it gets clean." That evening, my parents called an emergency family meeting. Ashley arrived late, dressed impeccably. Her posture controlled, her expression wounded in exactly the right proportions. She hugged my mother first, lingering just long enough to reinforce the image of closeness. She didn't look at me. When my father spoke, his voice trembled despite his effort to sound firm. "Ashley says there are documents that suggest money was moved with your involvement." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. "That's a lie," I said evenly. Ashley sighed softly, like someone burdened by disappointment. "I didn't want it to come out like this," she said. "But the truth has a way of surfacing." I stared at her, struck by how easily the words rolled off her tongue. "The truth," I repeated. She met my gaze then, and for a split second the mask slipped. There was no remorse there, only calculation. "I think we need an independent review," she continued, "for everyone's protection." Evelyn leaned forward. "I agree." Ashley blinked. "You do?" "Yes," Evelyn said calmly. "A full forensic audit. External. No internal bias." Ashley hesitated just a fraction too long. "Of course," she said finally. "Transparency is important." That hesitation told me everything. Over the next week, the house filled with tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. Phones rang late at night. Doors closed quietly. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Ashley played her part flawlessly, tearful when appropriate, indignant when challenged, always just believable enough. But forensic accounting doesn't care about performances. Evelyn brought in a specialist. Someone who didn't know our family, didn't care about our history, didn't flinch at emotional pressure. Someone who followed trails, not stories. I sat through hours of questioning, providing bank records, employment contracts, timelines of my investments. It was exhausting, invasive, and terrifying in ways I hadn't expected. But it was also clarifying. Every legitimate transaction in my life stood up to scrutiny. Ashley's didn't. Patterns emerged. Metadata inconsistencies, approval chains that collapsed under examination, files created months after the dates they supposedly documented. The forged documents pointing to me unraveled quickly once examined closely. Too quickly. Ashley's story began to wobble. She grew sharper, more defensive, snapped at the auditors, accused them of bias, claimed persecution. My parents watched this shift with dawning horror. One night, as I passed the study, I heard my mother crying. Not loud sobs. The quiet kind, the ones that come when denial finally runs out. Ashley noticed it too. Her next move came fast. She sent a message to the group chat claiming she feared for her safety, that the stress was unbearable, that she didn't know how much more she could take. It was a familiar tactic, one that had worked for years, but this time it landed differently. The auditors didn't pause. The numbers didn't soften. The truth didn't bend. And for the first time, I saw something in Ashley's eyes that unsettled me more than her anger ever had. Fear. Not of losing money, not of losing status, but of losing the story she'd told herself her entire life. The golden daughter wasn't just being questioned. She was being exposed. And no amount of performance could stop what was already in motion. The morning Ashley was officially confronted, the house felt unnaturally quiet, like it was holding its breath. The auditors had finished their preliminary report the night before. Evelyn called me just after sunrise and asked me to come to the office immediately. Her voice was calm, but underneath it I could hear something resolute, almost final. When I arrived, Ashley was already there. She sat at the far end of the conference table, arms crossed, chin lifted, dressed like she was heading into a board presentation instead of a reckoning. Our parents sat side by side near the middle, tense and pale. I took the chair closest to the door, not out of fear but instinct. I wanted space. I wanted clarity. Evelyn didn't waste time. "The forensic review is complete," she said, placing a thick binder on the table. "And before anyone speaks, I want to be very clear. This is no longer about assumptions or family dynamics. This is about documented facts." Ashley let out a humorless laugh. "You always did love dramatics, Aunt Evelyn." Evelyn didn't react. She opened the binder and began turning pages with deliberate precision. Over the past 4 years, Ashley diverted company funds through fabricated vendors, falsified reimbursements, and manipulated internal approvals. The total amount misappropriated exceeds $120,000. My mother gasped softly. My father's hands clenched together. Ashley leaned back in her chair, unfazed. "That's an interpretation." "No," Evelyn said. "It's a conclusion." She slid a set of documents toward our parents. "Here are the transaction logs. Here are the metadata timestamps." And here she paused, letting the silence sharpen, are the files linking Ashley to the forged documents that attempted to place responsibility on her sister. Every muscle in my body went rigid. My father looked up slowly. "Ashley," he said, his voice barely audible. "You tried to blame her." Ashley's eyes flicked to me, then away. I was protecting myself. "By destroying your sister," my mother whispered. Ashley scoffed. "She would have survived. She always does." That sentence landed harder than any accusation. I stood then not because I planned to speak, but because I needed to breathe. For years, I said quietly, I thought being overlooked was the worst thing you could do to someone. I was wrong. Ashley finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Her composure cracking just enough to reveal the fury beneath. You think you're innocent in all this? She snapped. You waltz in with your little investments and act like you earned some moral high ground. I earned my life, I replied. You stole yours. The room went still. Evelyn closed the binder. The company's legal counsel has been notified. Ashley, you are suspended effective immediately. Access revoked. You can't do this, Ashley said, rising from her seat. I built half this company. You exploited it, Evelyn corrected. And you endangered it. My father finally stood, his face etched with something like grief. I gave you everything, he said, and you used it to hurt your own family. Ashley's voice broke. You made me this way. That was when I realized she truly believed it. The meeting ended without theatrics. No shouting, no dramatic exits. Just the quiet collapse of a narrative Ashley had controlled for most of her life. But it wasn't over. 2 days later, my phone rang at midnight. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, Ashley's voice came through low and frantic. They're coming after me, she said. You have to help me. I closed my eyes. You framed me. I panicked, she said. You don't understand what it's like to fall. I do, I said. I've been falling my entire life. I just learned how to land. She went quiet, then whispered, If I go down, I'll make sure you do too. The line went dead. The next morning, I was served papers at work. Ashley had filed a formal complaint accusing me of conspiracy, insider manipulation, and defamation. The claims were absurd, stitched together with fragments of truth and layers of invention, but they were serious enough to demand response. Evelyn called immediately. This is her last move. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I figured. Legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. Ashley's own documentation became her undoing. The same forensic trail that exposed her theft dismantled her accusations against me piece by piece. Her threats collapsed under scrutiny. The complaint was dismissed, but the emotional damage lingered. At home, my parents were quiet, subdued. The house no longer revolved around Ashley's needs. Without her presence dominating every room, the emptiness felt both painful and relieving. One evening, my mother knocked on my door. I should have protected you, she said, tears spilling freely now that there was no one left to perform for. I was so afraid of losing her that I forgot I was losing you. I didn't answer right away. I don't need apologies, I said finally. I need boundaries. She nodded like someone finally understanding the rules of a language they'd ignored for years. Ashley didn't come home again. Her attorney contacted us instead. Charges were being prepared. Negotiations discussed. Restitution demanded. And somewhere between the legal filings and the silence that followed, something inside me shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for approval. Not for justice to feel satisfying. Not for Ashley to understand what she'd done. The truth had already done its work. And for the first time, I wasn't standing in her shadow. I was standing in my own life, watching the consequences finally catch up to the golden daughter who had always believed she was untouchable. The first court date arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, and I realized how different truth feels when it's no longer just personal. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. Ashley sat across the aisle from me, flanked by her attorney, hair pulled back too tightly, jaw set in defiance. She didn't look at me. Not once. It was as if refusing to acknowledge me could erase what she'd done. I watched my parents enter behind her, slower than usual, like people who had aged overnight. My father's shoulders were rounded now, his confidence replaced by something heavier. My mother clutched her purse like a lifeline. When the judge called the case, Ashley finally lifted her head. The charges were read calmly: embezzlement, fraud, forgery, attempted false attribution of financial crimes. Each word felt unreal, not because they were exaggerated, but because they had been hiding in plain sight for years. Ashley's attorney argued mitigation, stress, family pressure, poor oversight. He spoke about her education, her leadership role, her supposed contributions to the company. He painted her as overwhelmed, misunderstood, pushed too hard. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke with a clarity no performance could match. The forensic accountant presented timelines, transaction paths, digital fingerprints. Every forged document carried Ashley's signature in ways only someone deeply familiar with the system could replicate. Every attempt to implicate me collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. The judge listened without interruption. When the ruling came, Ashley's posture finally broke. She was ordered to repay the full amount. Criminal proceedings would continue, travel restrictions imposed, professional credentials under review. Ashley exhaled sharply like someone punched in the gut. Outside the courtroom, reporters lingered. I avoided them. This wasn't about spectacle. It never had been. My parents approached me cautiously. "I don't know how to fix this," my father said. "You can't," I replied. "You can only stop pretending it didn't happen." That night I slept better than I had in months, not because I felt victorious, because the waiting was over. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not peaceful. Ashley moved out of her apartment and into a temporary rental arranged by her attorney. She lost her position at the company officially. Her social circle evaporated. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. For the first time in her life, no one was cushioning her fall. I focused on my work. I closed on another property, this one a small mixed-use building that required careful negotiation and patience. The deal reminded me who I was when no one was watching. Disciplined, methodical, unflashy. Evelyn checked in regularly, not as an authority figure, but as an ally. "You did everything right," she told me one afternoon. "Don't let the noise convince you otherwise." The noise, though, found me anyway. Ashley left a voicemail one night. Her voice sounded different, stripped of polish, raw. "They hate me," she said. "Everyone hates me now." I didn't respond. Another message followed days later. I never meant for it to go this far. Still, I stayed silent. Then came the one that finally made my hands shake. "I needed to win," she whispered. "And you were always in the way." That was when I understood something fundamental. Ashley didn't see me as a sister. She saw me as an obstacle, and obstacles to her were meant to be removed. I saved the message, forwarded it to Evelyn and my attorney. Let it take its place among the facts. At home, the dynamic shifted. My parents tried awkwardly to connect with me. Dinners without tension, conversations without comparison. But years of imbalance don't disappear overnight. One evening, my mother asked, "Why didn't you ever tell us how bad it was?" "I did," I said gently. "You just didn't hear me." She nodded, tears welling. "I hear you now. It was a start, not a resolution." Ashley's trial date was set for early fall. In the meantime, the company began restructuring. New controls, new leadership paths. Evelyn remained steady through it all, the quiet backbone Ashley had underestimated. I attended a board meeting for the first time not as a participant, but as an observer. No one ignored me. No one dismissed me. Respect, I realized, isn't demanded. It's recognized. One afternoon, Ashley appeared unexpectedly at my office building. Security called me before letting her up. I hesitated, then agreed. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. Her eyes darted around the lobby like she was waiting for judgment to materialize from the walls. "I just want to talk," she said. We sat across from each other in a glass-walled room. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said quickly. I just want you to know I didn't plan to hurt you at first. At first, I repeated. She winced. I didn't think you mattered. There it was, the truth finally unmasked. I mattered enough to frame, I said. She looked down. I needed someone to carry the blame. And you chose me because you thought I'd stay quiet. She didn't deny it. I'm not going to save you, I said calmly. And I'm not going to destroy you. I'm just stepping out of your story. Her shoulders slumped. I don't know who I am without it. That's not my problem, I said. When she left, I felt no triumph, just distance, the kind that heals. As the trial approached, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't defining myself in opposition to Ashley anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I was living. And that more than any verdict felt like the final shift in power. The verdict came down on a Thursday afternoon, quiet and decisive. Ashley pled guilty to multiple counts as part of a negotiated agreement. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no tearful apology that changed anyone's mind. Just a list of charges, a sentence that balanced accountability with restraint, and a restitution order that would follow her for years. I wasn't in the courtroom when it happened. I was walking through a property I was considering purchasing, sunlight filtering through dusty windows, my mind focused on floor plans and renovation timelines. When my phone buzzed with Evelyn's message, I stopped in the middle of the empty living room and leaned against the wall. It was over. Not the consequences. Those were just beginning. But the waiting, the tension, the constant vigilance, that part was finished. That evening, my parents came over, not to talk about Ashley, not to rehash the past. They brought dinner, a small, awkward gesture that somehow meant more than grand declarations ever could. We ate quietly at first, the clink of silverware louder than conversation. I'm proud of you, my father said finally. Not for surviving. Not for staying silent. For standing firm. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You built your life without shortcuts, she said. I see that now. I nodded. I didn't have a choice. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, the house finally still. I thought about the years I'd spent shrinking myself to keep peace, the way I'd learned to be low maintenance, agreeable, invisible, and how exhausting that had been. The company changed quickly after Ashley's departure. New leadership protocols, transparent reporting, clear boundaries between family and business. Evelyn oversaw the transition with steady resolve, refusing to let emotion cloud structural decisions. It's not about punishment, she told the board. It's about sustainability. The company survived. More than that, it stabilized. Ashley began serving her sentence quietly. There were no public statements, no appeals to sympathy. The world moved on faster than she'd expected. She wrote me once from a place of mandated accountability, not asking for help, not blaming anyone, just acknowledging that she'd confused love with entitlement and success with attention. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Forgiveness. I realized doesn't always require participation. As months passed, my life expanded in ways that had nothing to do with my family. I mentored younger women entering real estate, watched them recognize their own potential, their own quiet strength. I traveled more, invested carefully, slept deeply. I stopped bracing myself in rooms full of people. At a holiday gathering later that year, the absence of tension was almost startling. No performances, no comparisons, just conversation. My mother caught my eye across the room and smiled. Not the anxious, searching smile I remembered, but something simpler. Present. Later that night, she said, I wish I'd known sooner. I replied, I'm glad you know now. Ashley remained part of the family history, but not the center of it. Her story became one of consequence, not myth. One afternoon, Evelyn joined me for coffee. You know, she said, stirring her cup, you were never weak. You were patient. I smiled. There's a difference. She nodded. And now you don't have to be either. On the anniversary of the New Year's party, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, noticing how little that night defined me anymore. It had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. The glass of red wine that once burned my skin had washed something else away too, the last illusion that fairness would be given freely. I'd earned my peace, and I intended to keep it. As I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I realized that the most satisfying part of this entire ordeal wasn't watching Ashley fall. It was watching myself rise quietly, steadily into a life that no longer required permission or comparison. The golden daughter's shadow no longer reached me. I had stepped fully into my own light. The first new year after everything ended arrived without fireworks inside my chest. I stood in my kitchen just before midnight, watching the city lights through the window, realizing how unfamiliar peace can feel when you've spent a lifetime bracing for impact. There was no family party this year. No forced smiles, no carefully managed conversations. Just me, a quiet room, and the soft ticking of a clock that no longer sounded like a countdown to something going wrong. I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who learned early that love in our house came with conditions. That being overlooked was safer than being seen. That keeping your head down was a form of survival. I had mistaken endurance for virtue, silence for strength. What I learned instead was this silence only protects people who benefit from it. The weeks after Ashley's sentencing were strange. Without the crisis to respond to, life slowed into something almost gentle. I woke up without dread. I made plans without calculating who might sabotage them. I invested my energy where it grew instead of where it was drained. My parents tried in their own imperfect ways. Sometimes they said the wrong thing, sometimes they said nothing at all. But the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer auditioning for fairness. I had stepped out of the role they'd assigned me, and that changed everything. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts at my desk, I caught my reflection in the darkened screen. I looked solid, grounded, like someone who trusted herself. That version of me had been forming quietly for years, brick by brick, while no one was paying attention. Hidden power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. Ashley wrote one final letter before cutting contact entirely. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for help. She wrote that she finally understood what she had mistaken for love all her life. That being chosen without accountability had hollowed her out. That she didn't know who she was without applause. I folded the letter and put it away. Understanding someone doesn't mean returning to the fire that burned you. Spring came, then summer. My portfolio grew. My confidence deepened. I started turning down opportunities that didn't align instead of chasing validation. The difference was subtle but profound. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. At a small gathering later that year, someone asked about my family business. I answered simply, no bitterness, no over-explaining. I noticed how little it mattered now to define myself through that story. Family drama has a way of convincing you that it's the center of the universe. It's not. It's just one chapter. The real inheritance I claimed wasn't money or approval. It was self-trust, the kind that doesn't evaporate when someone raises their voice or questions your worth. The kind that survives betrayal. Looking back, the wine glass shattering against my face at that New Year's party feels like a line drawn in time. Before it, I was shrinking to fit a narrative that didn't serve me. After it, I stopped asking for permission to exist fully. Revenge didn't come in the form of public humiliation or dramatic speeches. It came quietly, in boundaries that held, in consequences that stuck, in a life that no longer revolved around proving anything to anyone. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story, I want you to hear this clearly. Being the overlooked one doesn't mean you're weak. It often means you're the one building something real, while others are consuming attention. Justice doesn't always look the way we imagine. Sometimes it looks like clarity. Sometimes it looks like walking away without guilt. Sometimes it looks like letting the truth do its work while you keep living. As midnight arrived, I poured myself a glass of water, not champagne. I didn't need a toast to mark the moment. I had already crossed the threshold. The year ahead didn't promise ease, but it promised honesty, and that was enough. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know why. Have you ever been the one who did everything right and still got blamed? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about family drama betrayal and the quiet kind of revenge that actually changes lives, make sure you're subscribed. These conversations don't end here. They grow. Thank you for being here, for listening, for reflecting. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth, step back, and let the tables turn on their own.